Howard Fredrics, and I'm honored to welcome a remarkable author, Raphael Golb, whose book, The Qumran Khan, chronicles his 10-year legal battle against criminal charges stemming from his online defense of his father's theory of the origin of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were a set of Hebrew manuscripts encompassing portions of the Old Testament and related religious texts, and which were written and copied in or around Jerusalem at the time of the Second Temple period between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, during a time that was marked by the Roman Empire's siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The scrolls were first discovered over a 9-year period between 1947 and 1956 in the Qumran caves, which are located in the West Bank, about a mile from the Dead Sea. Raphael's father, Norman Golb, was Ludwig Rosenberger Professor of Jewish Civilization and a world-renowned Hebrew manuscript scholar at the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute. Professor Golb's research and writings, which include his seminal 1995 book, Who Wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, set forth an alternative to the traditional, at the time, widely held Qumran sectarian theory of the origin of the scrolls, espoused by, among others, NYU professor Lawrence Schiffman, whereby a small religious sect of monks was said to have produced the scrolls at the site of Qumran, near the caves where the scrolls were hidden. Norman Golb's research conclusions, known as the Jerusalem Libraries theory, on the other hand, asserts that the scrolls were remnants of a literature showing a wide variety of Jewish practices, beliefs, and opinions, and that they were part of a number of separate private libraries that were removed from Jerusalem and transported to Qumran before and during the siege and sacking of the city by the Romans. Golb's theory was initially largely rejected by traditionalist scholars, but it has gradually, over time, become more widely acknowledged within the academic community as a legitimate opposing scholarly position. 15 years ago, the Jewish Museum in New York became the first exhibiting institution to inform the public that there were 2 basic theories of Dead Sea Scrolls origin. Until that time, Golb's research had been systematically excluded from museum exhibits. Arising from his experiences confronting academic institutions and museums, and his legal ordeal that ensued, whereby Raphael was initially found guilty of 31 criminal counts, sentenced to 6 months at Rikers Island and 5 years of probation, as well as being barred from posting online with pseudonyms. Raphael's book explores a number of current issues affecting our society, including the scope of the First Amendment, as well as the value of truth in an increasingly truth-challenged information age. Raphael received his BA from Oberlin College in 1980 with an individual major in classics and Romance languages. He then went on to earn a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard and a JD from NYU School of Law, eventually becoming a practicing lawyer. Raphael, I'd like to welcome you to PKRG-TV.
Good to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here today, both because I've been following your story since around 2010, when I first read news accounts of your trial in the New York Times, and because having gotten to know you personally over these years since then, while following your legal appeals process, I also consider you to be both a friend as well as a strong advocate for both constitutional freedoms and academic integrity. So, Raphael, why is your book important, and what can ordinary readers relate to in your story?
Well, this is a book about the truth, the value of the truth. It's a book about power, what happens when power is abused. It's about freedom of debate. These are all extremely important issues in America today. And so if you're thinking about these broader issues, I propose the Dead Sea Scrolls as an example of what can go wrong in our society and what can happen as a consequence of that.
So what is the most important lesson you learned from your father's scholarly struggles?
Well, my father was a unique figure in American scholarship. He came from a generation of very highly educated people way back in the 1940s and 50s, because a lot of scholars came over from Europe at that time who were fleeing from Germany. And these were like brilliant European scholars, and he had the opportunity to study with many of these scholars. So he was of a higher class than most of the younger generation of scholars today. And for him, the fundamental principle was skeptical rationalism. He always looked at every question as if it were being posed for the first time, anew. So he didn't accept ideas just because they had become commonplace, because other people accepted him. He wasn't afraid to be the only person in the room who disagreed with everybody. So that was really the most important lesson from him, that not to be afraid of power, not to go with the flock, but to be your own person and to stick to your guns.
I think you certainly have done that over the years. That's for sure.
Well, I do think there is a question of legacy, and that's why I wrote this book, because my father became the victim of a campaign to suppress his work, and he stood firm, and I believe it's important to set the record straight, because today major archaeologists in Israel agree with him fundamentally, and in that respect I must disagree a little bit with the way you put things in the introduction, which was wonderful. Thank you so much for that. But you said that I defended my father's theory. That's not what I was doing. I was defending the truth. So it wasn't that I was defending the theory. I was explaining what the theory was, and I was saying, there are people here trying to suppress these ideas. You can't do that. You have to have a debate.
So the theory then is emblematic of the truth itself, was what you were defending then?
Well, there's a process. There's a scientific process. There are scientific standards. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have become a spectacle. They no longer follow that scientific methodology that's so fundamental. It's simply a question of repeating dogma about an old theory which has been refuted initially by my father, but then by a whole series of other scholars. So they repeat this from time to time in museums, in televised programs, in the media, in news items, in many different places. They repeat this, and then there's never any time to point out any of the mistakes that have been made, any of the flaws in what they're saying, because they just move on to something else in the news cycle, right? It's just like 2 seconds. We're living in a society of the 2-minute read, right? You read something 2 minutes, then you go on to something else. So there's no time to have even a discussion. So then a few months later, it comes back. Again, the same thing. So it's become an ideology, right? It's like an idea, an old idea, which is repeated over and over again with great eloquence by performers, by pundits and everything, who pretend that this idea has not been refuted. So that's not scholarship, that's not scientific. I object to that, and that's what my thing was about. I studied at Harvard with many great professors in my field, and the fundamental thing that they taught me was that you have to have respect for the history of scholarship in the field, and you have to examine that, but you have to examine it in a critical manner. And if you realize that somebody's made a mistake, it's important to say so and to go into the details of that and to explain why. That's what scholarship is based on. That's what my father did, and that's what you have to. You have to stick to those standards. Otherwise, our entire educational system, the standards that our system rests on, they get lost. And we have a weaker educational system. That's the problem here.
So you were a fantastic sounding board for your father. You were doing that for him, during the course of his career, you were able to do that with him.
I always took a critical attitude towards him, as well as anybody else. There are aspects of his theory that have been modified a little bit by some of the Israeli archaeologists who, in essence, they agree with him. But I find that some of their explanations are, in certain ways, more convincing than some of his. And I find some of his more convincing than theirs. I'm perfectly critical about that. What I don't find acceptable is an effort to suppress not only his work, but their work as well. That's what's happening today. That's not acceptable.
Well, knowledge is something that evolves over time, and it's constantly being shaped, reformulated, and adapted, and that's how it grows, and that's how new knowledge comes about. It's a gradual, nuanced process.
Well, it should be that way, that's fine, but sometimes it doesn't work the way it's supposed to work.
Correct.
And there's a great book about this, the theory of scientific revolution by Thomas Kuhn, and one of his fundamental points is that often scientific theories don't evolve because people, eventually they do, maybe 100 years later, but for very long periods of time, the old theories are promulgated in encyclopedias, and they don't change them when they're refuted.
So now let's talk a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls controversy itself, how you addressed it, and the impact of the controversy on museum exhibitions. So why does the origin of the scrolls matter to us today? And how do you explain the continued lack of serious public attention to the scrolls controversy?
Okay, the scrolls matter to us because this is the origins of Western civilization. This is fundamental, right? So it matters where we came from. I think we can all identify with that. So I'll leave it at that, but it matters. Look, it also matters because of the way that this controversy has developed. So the origin of the scrolls matters to us as a subject matter, as a topic, because of academic ethics, the academic controversy surrounding their origins and how that has played out over the decades.
Why aren't people interested in this?
Well, this is what I was saying before. The Dead Sea Scrolls have become a spectacle, right? And so you don't have serious attention to something when it's all a matter of the branding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because that's what's happened to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's a shame, because the truth about the Dead Sea Scrolls is something that's really important to us. And they've become treated now as this little, like a revealed mystery. And there's like a religious effusion that it comes, the revealed mystery, right? But that has nothing to do with the truth, with the value of scholarship, of the science of their study. It's just like a merchandising of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sale of the scrolls. And a topic that I explore in great detail in my book, because the old theory about the scrolls, the only reason that the scrolls were of interest to people originally was because people thought that they contained some secret about the origins of Christianity. And you have to realize the Dead Sea Scrolls were originally studied by a group of Christian scholars. They were discovered in a place that at that time was part of Jordan. And then they were held in a museum, the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, until 1967. And so the Jordanians controlled all of these Hebrew manuscripts, and they appointed a monk, Father Roland DeVoe, to be the head of a whole committee that would study them. And he was an anti-Semite, and not a single Jew could participate in the study of these scrolls. He belonged, before he became a monk, he was a member of a fascist group in France. And then he went to East Jerusalem and he became a monk. He was an anti-Semite. And this is part of the legacy of the early scholarship of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they were sold to evangelical interest groups, And their only interest for the public for decades and decades was this question of what might they reveal about the origins of Christianity. But it's like a strange imposition on them. These are ancient Hebrew manuscripts, the product of the Jews of Jerusalem of ancient times. There's nothing about the origins of Christianity in them, not a single word. This is just nonsense. But that's what they mean in people's minds today. That's a terrible thing. It's a shame.
They just put up literally a roadblock that prevented Jews from accessing these scrolls and studying them.
Not only Jews, but for the roadblock to accessing and studying them, that went on for decades. They were monopolized by this little team that Roland de Vaux had appointed. And if you didn't belong to that team, if you didn't share their ideas, you weren't allowed to study the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a scandal. It's an outrage.
So what role has the rise of the internet as an information tool, for example, with the rise of Wikipedia, played in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship and the propagation of the Qumran sectarian theory? How have these tools been used to suppress information that differs from traditional theories?
Well, the internet is a very complex thing. So we can divide it into two topics.
Sure.
One, Wikipedia.
Yes.
And the other, branding. Because let's start with the second one. Let's start with branding. Today, with Facebook and all of these other social media sites, it's all about branding. Everybody is trying to brand himself to become a star on the internet, an influencer, right? So that's what internet culture is today. It's all about branding. And that's what the Dead Sea Scrolls are about. It's about scholars branding themselves. It's become part of the general culture. They have their websites. Right? So it's no longer about serious scholarship. It's about the image that the scholar presents himself. I'm this expert in this field. He's an expert. So what he says must be true. It doesn't work that way. It's true if you're subjected to evaluation by other people, and if they confirm the truth of what you're saying. If they point out that your view is flawed and that you're saying things which are false and erroneous, and that if you're plagiarizing people, if you're misrepresenting other people's views, that's a terrible problem. But of course, the image that the public gets of you on the internet doesn't have any of that. It's fake. Right? So that's a big problem with the internet. Now, when you come to things like Wikipedia, there you have actual wars going on Wikipedia between different people. So if you're a minority, you're going to be voted out. So you have a majority of people flowing with the flock. They're too afraid to say that they disagree with something. And by the way, I'm not the only person saying this. The great Israeli archaeologist Yitzhak Magen, in his final report on Qumran, which was issued 6 years ago, in 2018, in his final report, he says, people are too afraid. They're too afraid to say that they disagree with the old theory. Because if you disagree with the old theory, you're not going to get grants, you're not going to be included, your articles are not going to be accepted for publication in the review of what he calls the new Qumran sect. Right? He's a master of irony, because there's the Qumran sect, which people have been claiming wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls with no evidence. He says it's baseless. There's not any basis at all for the idea that a sect wrote these scrolls or gathered them at Qumran. There's no basis for the claim that any sect lived at Qumran.
So what happens on Wikipedia when you, for example, post information that others disagree with?
It just gets edited out. You'll get into an edit war. It happened to me during my campaign. And I didn't try to insert information about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's a long story. But certain things that I put onto certain relevant Wikipedia pages were just knocked off.
Yep. So why was your father's contribution to scrolls research discomforting to so many different scholars?
Well, there are two different explanations, and they complement each other to some extent, but my father's explanation, because I often asked him this, and he said it's just because these people had based their careers on this.
Yes.
And it's as simple as that. And so they didn't like being told that they had made a mistake. It was embarrassing to them. So what I was interested in, because I got into this through the museum exhibits about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and to me these scrolls are being marketed towards the evangelical community. It's quite clear if you look at the content of the museum exhibits. And so for me, the question was, what are the religious implications of the different theories? And are there religious reasons why those people who have believed for all these years in the old theory, why they continue to believe in it? And in my opinion, there are. And so read my book for all the details.
So for somebody who has very strongly held religious beliefs that are tied to their particular view of the origin of the Dead Sea Scrolls, then they're going to be very uncomfortable if somebody comes along like your father and challenges that view.
Oh, well, there's another point to be made about that. But first of all, just to clarify, there's a Christian belief, for centuries there's been a Christian belief that Jesus might have been an Essene. Right? And the sect that they believe, that most of them believe, wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and gathered the Dead Sea Scrolls. They think it's the Essenes. That's where they try and look for connections with early Christianity. And to be told that, no, it's not the Essenes, it's discomforting for them, because you're saying that Christianity didn't originate from Essene scrolls, Essene ideas that we find in the scrolls. Christianity originated from Judaism, and that's discomforting for them. They like to think that Christianity originated from this pure, radical sect of pacifists, the Essenes, who lived in the desert. For them, that's comforting, because it gives a kind of purity to early Christianity. And the idea that Christianity simply originated from the general flow of Judaism at that time is discomforting for them. Orthodox Jews have their own reasons for potentially being discomforted by this, because if all of these different ideas, including many, there are some scrolls which are not of an orthodox nature, which are more of a heterodox nature. And if there were libraries in Jerusalem that contain such literature, this is discomforting for them, because they think of Jerusalem, they associate it always with the temple and the temple priesthood, right? But Jerusalem was a big city. Some estimates say that like 1 million people lived there at that time. So sometimes religion and history and science don't fit together. So it's a problem.
So in other words, the notion that these scrolls actually were situated in a number of different libraries rather than centralized in a single temple is something that is difficult for some Orthodox Jews to accept.
Well, that's an interesting statement that you just made because of the temple. But there's a common misrepresentation of my father's theory, which is to say that, according to him, the scrolls came from the temple of Jerusalem. Not at all. He never said that. That's a theory that was proposed way back in the 1950s by a German scholar named Rengstorff. And my father, from the very beginning, he said that Rengstorff was wrong, because there are too many different ideas in the scrolls, including ideas which conflict with the ideas of the Orthodox Judaism of the temple priesthood. So the idea that you have over 1,000 scrolls here, right? You have 975 scrolls approximately, and then some of them are tiny fragments. So there must have been many more scrolls originally than were found, because sometimes all you have of a single scroll is just this much. So the weather conditions over the years must have destroyed possibly even hundreds of scrolls. There must have been many more than were found in the caves. So a private library at that time, maybe 30, 40 books, 30, 40 scrolls. Do the math. We're talking of something like 40 or 50, maybe 60 or 70 different libraries here. That's a lot of different libraries. So this is very discomforting for people who associate Jerusalem with the temple. And there might have been a natural inclination. It could have something to do with how this misrepresentation originated, because if you're an Orthodox scholar and you're looking at this, and, oh, he says they came from Jerusalem, and he must think they came from the temple. So that's not an excuse, because if you're a scholar, you have to read what somebody is saying, and when he says something, you don't leap to conclusions, especially if he's saying precisely that they did not come from the temple. And say, how can you start saying that he says that they came from the temple? It's not proper.
Yes. So can you say something about the nature of the disagreement that you had with a number of scholars? Some people say that you were defending your father and that there's something unkosher about that.
Well, first of all, there's nothing unkosher about defending your father. If my father got me a job at the University of Chicago, for example, that I wasn't qualified for, that would be unkosher. There's not something unkosher about defending your father. Well, the implication, what they're trying to suggest, is that maybe his father was telling him to do this, and he doesn't really know anything about this. No, I've been following this for many years. I got into this. My father didn't even know I was doing this. My interest was the museum exhibits. And that's how the conflict with scholars originated, because I started posting things online about these museum exhibits. And then one of them came on and started disagreeing with me, and from there to another thing. My whole campaign was about the museum exhibits. It wasn't about my father's theory.
So NYU professor Lawrence Schiffman was one of the first Jewish scholars granted access to examine the scrolls. Does this fact afford him any deference with respect to his position in the field? And did that early access impact on the way that he's been viewed by other scholars? In other words, did it afford him a measure of power over the wider community of scholars?
Well, first you're asking me about deference, and then about power.
Yes.
So those are two different
True.
things. First you have a moral question.
Yes.
Should people give deference to somebody because he was brought into a monopoly? I don't think so. The monopoly was unkosher. That's unkosher, right? A monopoly is not acceptable. In the sense that we have a world of scholarship that's based on the principle of free access, free and open debate, the freedom to publish, to examine historical documents. If you go to Cambridge University in England, where they have thousands of manuscripts from the Cairo Geniza, any qualified scholar can go and study those manuscripts. You don't have to belong to a special group that's been selected by a monk. What kind of nonsense is that?
So the very fact that Jews were prevented from accessing the scrolls in the first instance doesn't give any extra deference to somebody who happens to just have been the first one who was granted that access, because it was wrong in the first place to have denied access.
It was wrong for him to agree to participate in a monopoly.
I see.
So this actually came up in his testimony at my trial. And he said, only one scroll, he said. But in a newspaper article about him years before that, he had said, if I needed to see something, if I followed the politics long enough, I always got it. He based his career on that scroll. He became associated with his work on that scroll, which turned out to be deeply flawed.
So did that put him in a position of power over other scholars?
Well, I don't know if his power was due to that, or if it was due to just to what he calls Dead Sea Scrolls politics. What kind of thing is it you're doing your research based on politics? There's a fundamental difference between politics and science. It's not right. It's not right. My father would never have engaged in politics to see a Dead Sea Scroll. It would have been abhorrent to him. He would have refused to go along with such a thing. And he would have insisted that you have to open them up to scholars at large.
Yeah, obviously Professor Schiffman didn't quite go along with that line of thinking. So you suggest that Professor Schiffman distorted the nature of your father's theory while adopting some of its essential elements. Can you elaborate a bit on how Schiffman misrepresented your father's theory and the aspects of your father's theory which Schiffman may have adopted as his own?
Okay, well, it's not only Schiffman.
I see.
So, as far as I know, he was the first one. And this is what I mentioned before about the misrepresentation that according to my father, the scrolls came from the Temple of Jerusalem. And in Schiffman's case, he's made it multiple times over the years, even after it was corrected by my father in his book. There's a chapter in which he talks about Schiffman's theory for like 10, 15 pages, and then he speaks about the misrepresentations. And there you have a footnote, and he explains that that's one of the fundamental misrepresentations that Schiffman has been making about his work. That's not acceptable. And incidentally, in the letter that Schiffman distributed to his faculty officials, which we might talk about later on, he mentions my father's discussion of his views in his book. So he's read my father's book. He must have seen that he had been corrected.
So what of your father's ideas did Schiffman perhaps appropriate?
Oh, well, that's the other side of the coin. There was a whole tendency starting in the 1980s, in the wake of my father's research, to start emphasizing the fact that there are different ideas among the scrolls. So my father was the first one to have based a theory on this multiplicity of ideas among the scrolls. It's a fundamental point. People had noticed it a little bit before, but it had always been just a kind of little point made on the side. But then starting around 1988, after my father had published several articles on this matter, Schiffman starts to talk about all the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were gathered by a sect at Qumran, but they contain multiple Judaisms. This whole idea of multiple Judaisms. And then it's picked up by other scholars after that. There's a great variety of ideas among the scrolls, but none of them point out that my father was the first one to really base a theory on this. So if you're reading an article by Schiffman on this in 1988, or even in Schiffman's book about this that came out in 1994, if you're reading the stuff, you think, oh, he's coming up with these ideas. He's not giving you the tools that you can use to go and examine the other point of view, what's been done with this fact by other scholars who disagree with you.
All good scholarship builds upon previous ideas, but it's important to acknowledge those ideas on which you build your own scholarship.
Well, this is exactly the problem with scholars like Dr. Schiffman. In his book on the scrolls, almost on the first page, if it's not the first page, it's the second page, he says, scholars agree that the scrolls were written by a sect at Qumran. Scholars agree.
Yeah.
Scholars don't agree. It's not proper to say that.
Yeah.
Say, many scholars agree, others disagree.
Language matters. The precision of language here is really important, I think. So you provide in your book a table, an actual table of quotations, side by side, from your father's writings and from the later writings of Professor Schiffman, showing how similar they are. And you suggest that these similarities may actually amount to plagiarism on the part of Schiffman. So how did these allegations first surface? Who raised them? And did other scholars agree with their concerns?
Well, there are a lot of questions in there. So who first raised this? It's important. I'm not the one who invented this. It's an Israeli journalist, Avi Katzman, who was an important journalist at the time. He wrote many groundbreaking articles in Haaretz, including articles about the Dead Sea Scrolls, long, in-depth investigative journalism about the controversy surrounding the origins of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he pointed this out in an interview with Schiffman. He said, but you've taken entire portions of the theory of Norman Golb and adapted them as your own without informing the public, without giving him proper credit. He said that's an allegation of plagiarism. I mean, he doesn't use the word, but if you look at New York University's definition of plagiarism, that's what plagiarism is.
So do you think that this was really plagiarism or just merely sloppy citation on the part of Professor Schiffman?
Well, sloppy citation, that's something else. Sloppy citation is when you, let's say you're describing the views of a certain school of thought, and you're explaining that according to this school of thought, blah, 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 blah. And then you forget to put your quotation, you're just quoting people, and you forget to put your quotation marks. That's sloppy citation. Professor Gay at Harvard University, who was the president of Harvard University and eventually stepped down during the controversy after her testimony in Congress. The reason she stepped down was because they were coming out with more and more examples of sloppy citation on her part. So that's not what's going on with Schiffman.
So the difference then being really more one of just a mistake versus deliberately avoiding citation.
Well, sloppy citation might be a mistake. She said it was a mistake on her part, but that question has to be examined always by an academic committee. Same thing with what happened with Dr. Schiffman. To me, it looks like plagiarism, but you have to have a committee examine it and make that decision. And that's, for me, that's the institutional question. Why was it never examined by a committee?
Yeah.
Because of his great influence, because it was not noticed, because he had a reputation for honesty, as one of the deans testified at the trial. It could be any one of those things, and for me, that's a big problem in any institution where you have allegations of misconduct and you don't have any investigation of it. So
plagiarism is such a serious allegation to lodge against somebody, and I think my experience has been in academia that people don't want to say something that's seriously negative about a colleague because either A, it could come back to bite them someday when that person comes after them, or it just creates an environment where collegiality is absent, and I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why that happens.
That's also one of the reasons why in New York University's code of conduct, when they discuss such allegations, they say that they can be made anonymously.
Yeah.
That's what anonymity is all about.
So can you tell us a little bit about the fraud surrounding the claims by Dead Sea Scrolls scholars concerning writings on a clay shard that were found at Qumran? Who were some of the perpetrators and debunkers of the fraud, and what was the evidence that served to expose this fraud?
Well, I won't get into all the details. They're in my book, but this is an interesting story, so I'll give some of the background. In 1997, there was a major conference on the Dead Sea Scrolls held in Jerusalem to celebrate the 50th anniversary of their discovery. And like a month or two before this conference, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, a major institution, they announced that they had discovered the first ever proof that a sect had lived at Qumran. And this proof that they claimed that they had discovered took the form of a clay shard on which they claimed that the word for the sect had appeared. In Hebrew, the word is hayachad. We can loosely translate it as the group. And this word appears in some of those heterodox Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, we don't know if the word refers to a single group or if it's different groups that call themselves the group. Because some of these texts that talk about a group, some of them have different ideas than some of the other texts, ideas that contradict with each other. So they seem to be written by different groups. But anyways, they say they found the word, the group, on a shard, kind of a receipt or a sale of contract that was found in the rubble at Qumran. And they said, you see, the group was selling something to somebody in Jericho or purchasing something from somebody in Jericho. And it talks about the group. So that's the first proof that the important thing to notice in this is that they're acknowledging that there was no proof until that moment. All of this time, they're talking about the sect at Qumran, but they had no proof. This is the fundamental point that my father had been making for many years. You have no proof for this claim you're making.
So now they have proof.
And so now suddenly we have proof. There's a shard. So my father was, of course, very interested in this. So he went to the Israel Museum and before the conference, and he said, I'd like to see the shard. So they brought him into a room. They put the shard there with a very strong light looking at it, and he examined the line in question and the word in question, and the word's not there. The word's not in the shard. So he looked at it closely, and then he looked at the transcription that they had published of it, and he saw that they had added on a stroke to change one of the letters, and I think they had taken off a stroke that's on another letter. So they transformed the word to read the Hayachad, the group.
Did they actually modify the physical scroll or just a copy of it?
No, the transcription that they made of it, that they published. They made a transcription of it. So what happened is my father had a whole lecture planned for that conference on the Jerusalem theory, on the problems with the sectarian theory, and he just set the lecture aside. He put up a photograph projected through a slide of the shard, and he said, "Where's the word? You say you found the first proof. Where's the word?" There was something like the 200, 300, 500 scholars from all over the world sitting there, and this was exposed to them as a falsification. That's part of the Dead Sea Scrolls scandal. That's the kind of thing that goes on with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a spectacle. It's got nothing to do with serious scholarship.
Some jaws must have dropped, hit the floor.
Well, what's worse, he then published an article about it. A prestigious Israeli paleographer published an article exposing the same fraud. And they continue to claim that that's the word. After that, they're still claiming it today. They claimed it 3 years later in the Encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls, edited by none other than Dr. Schiffman of New York University. It's crazy. Yeah. It's crazy. The word's not there.
So what about the Museum of the Bible? Can you tell me what happened at the Museum of the Bible and the forgeries that were displayed there?
Well, the Museum of the Bible is an evangelical institution in Washington, D.C., and it was created by, I guess, the Greens. It's a powerful evangelical family, billionaires, extremely wealthy people, and who have an ideology of Christianity, which is projected through this museum of theirs about the Bible. So part of the ideology of Christianity is that the Bible has remained unchanged since it was written, because there's a Christian doctrine of the inerrancy of the biblical text. Everything that's written in the Bible is true according to them, and there can be no mistake in the Bible. But the problem with that is there's no such thing as the Bible. There are different versions of the Bible. There are different manuscripts of the Bible through history. And so the doctrine that emerges in the Museum of the Bible is that these differences are minimal. Don't pay attention to these little differences. And there's It's a fundamental unity in the biblical text. And this is a very dubious and highly debated proposition. And there's an element of anti-Semitism in it, honestly. But,
what about the fraud there then?
well, yes, they have a portion of their exhibit is, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, because many copies of the Hebrew Bible were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. By the way, the Hebrew Bible is the neutral term. Some people say the Old Testament. That's a Christian term that has an anti-Semitic origin to it. It's very common today, many people use it, but Jewish scholars tend to avoid it, and I don't like to use it. So when I say the Hebrew Bible, I'm referring to the books generally publicly known as the Old Testament.
Yes.
So in the Museum of the Bible, they talk about the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? So they had an exhibit of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so they still have. It's like a permanent exhibit, a little section of the museum where you can read about the sect at Qumran. It's nonsense. So they had scrolls on display. And of course they were forgeries. They were forgeries that were being sold by some we don't even know who, but they got sold by someone in Israel to people, evangelical groups in America, and people were like studying them, and then they become exhibited. So eventually the forgery was exposed. They had it tested and shown to be a forgery, and they continued to display them. And now they just changed, and they said, oh, they're forgeries. What kind of an exhibit is that? It's
so
not
they
serious.
displayed forgeries, but at least at a certain point they admitted that they were forgeries.
It's kind of like it's rubbish. It's not a serious museum to be displaying forgeries. But the real problem with the Museum of the Bible is the ideology that's on display there, and the falsifications in the exhibit on the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not true that there was a sect on Qumran. They don't introduce the public to this debate, just like the other museums. So the museums that I was concerned with, they can be seen as leading up to the Museum of the Bible, which came later.
Mm-hmm. So what reason or reasons would various proponents of the more traditional Dead Sea Scroll theories have for excluding your father's work from museum exhibitions and other outlets?
Well, it's not so much that they're excluding his work in the sense that they're excluding his theory. That's not the real concern. The concern is that they're excluding the evidence which supports his theory. There's no mention of the reasons why the view that they have on display on all of their wall texts and in their selection of particular scrolls, among hundreds of other scrolls, there's no evidence, there's none of the evidence that would put that exhibit into question. So of course, if they included that, then the public would, people would be seeing these exhibits and would be saying, oh, but then this other stuff that they were saying here must be wrong. Yeah. So of course they exclude it.
So if you exclude the theory, then you don't need to include the evidence that supports that theory, or vice versa.
If you exclude the evidence, you don't need to mention the theory. Yeah,
that's
vice
exactly.
Versa.
Yes,
so
sure.
He didn't present an alternative theory. He refuted a theory. There's a difference between those two things. So I don't agree with this idea of having alternative theories, that you can choose this one or you could choose that one. It doesn't work like that in science. You have to have evidence, and you have to debate the evidence. You have to decide which of the two positions is more convincing than the other. So in a certain sense, I understand that people want to think, oh, he's presented an alternative, but that's not exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about an entire series of archaeologists and my father and other scholars as well who have said there's no basis for your theory.
Right. Sometimes when you present an alternative theory, you're also going to at the same time provide evidence that excludes an opposing theory.
Well, if you're talking about the interpretation of a poem, for example, that's different. You might have different readings of a poem.
Subjective.
And yeah, you argue, well, I
Certainly.
prefer my reading for these reasons. In history is more of a scientific field.
That's right.
In which you have empirical evidence you have the stones, you have the texts, you have the archaeological site, you have what we previously knew from chronicles written by other people living at that time. You have the revolt against Rome and the Roman siege and sacking of Jerusalem, the historical context. You have all of these things that you have to examine, and you have to look at the total configuration of the evidence, and you have to re-examine it.
So you express concern about some museum exhibitors' reluctance to present competing views on the origin of the Dead Sea Scrolls on their ostensible view that presenting a unitary theory would instill confidence rather than potentially muddying things up for attendees by suggesting that there is disagreement on facts surrounding the scrolls. Can you comment a bit on that?
That was a very long question, Howard. But I think you're referring to the statement by the curator of these exhibits, which was, oh, you don't want to confuse people with so many different theories. And that's when my internet campaign was really born. I had published a few things before that point, but when I saw that, I said, oh, this is great. And I published a short satirical article in which I said, absolutely, we can't go confusing people by explaining to them that there are two opposing theories about the origins of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They would become confused. You never know what happens if people become confused. They could go out in the streets afterwards and do, you never know what. So
their brains
must not
could explode.
confuse people. Must not confuse people. That would be very bad. So that's
never confuse people with the facts, as they say.
That's how my satirical persona came into being.
Of course. Sure. So who is Robert Cargill, and what is his significance in the debate over the origins of the scrolls, and what objections do you have against his ideas and actions as a scholar?
Well, Robert Cargill at that time was a graduate student, and my main concern wasn't Robert Cargill, it was his professor. Because in the news items that came out at that time, they were talking about a team at UCLA, and the team consisted of this professor and his student. So for me, the main thing was the professor, not the student. But as part of this work that they had done, there had been prepared a film that was being shown at the museum exhibit that took place in San Diego in 2007. And I wrote a lot of articles about this museum exhibit at the time because there were terrible problems with it. And one of the problems was this film. And my father got hold of the script that was being read out loud that accompanied the film. So they had a film projected in an auditorium, and then the docents would read the script. And somebody at the University of Chicago somehow had a connection there at the museum and got hold of the script and passed it on to my father. And he saw that it was filled with inaccurate statements, things just which were not true. So he published an article about it, and then I did some writing of my own about it. So
yeah.
I think that's what you're referring to here.
So, but I mean, in your book, you actually discuss the accompanying script for that screening of those films, of Cargill's films, at the San Diego Natural History Museum, and you mention Cargill's so-called third reason for including citations of archaeologist Yizar Hirschfeld's work in lieu of citing Norman Golb's work. What do you believe Cargill meant by the third reason?
Well, how this came about is interesting. My father gets the film script. He's reading it. He sent me a copy of it because he sent me a copy of it for a particular reason, because in the margin there was correspondence between Cargill and officials at the museum. I think, in fact, it was correspondence between him and somebody who was in charge of the museum's advertising campaign at the time. But he says in it, I think we should. This is not an exact quote, but I think this is the gist of what he says. I think that we should mention Hirschfeld at this point and not Golb. First, he says because Hirschfeld had taken Golb's proposal and had expanded upon it. And second of all, for another reason. And then he says, and there's a third reason, but I never write it down. So when I saw that, I said to my father, I think both of us know what the third reason is. And it turned out that I was right, because he testified to this.
And what was it?
The third reason was that there was an agreement that Norman Golb's name, my father's name, would not be mentioned in the museum exhibit. The interesting question about this is, was this only an agreement at this exhibit, or was it an agreement at all of the Dead Sea Scroll exhibits? Because he was not mentioned in these exhibits. And of course, Cargill claimed that this was a special agreement that they reached in reaction to my campaign of criticism, and perhaps also my father's articles about the exhibits, and that they decided that they would not mention his name. What kind of policy is that? Because you're being criticized by somebody who you believe is connected with Professor Golb, you're being criticized by Professor Golb, so you're not going to mention his name in a museum exhibit? What kind of a policy is that? For one thing, the theory should have been mentioned, the problems with the other theory should have been mentioned. So they have an exhibit which defends one point of view, and of course they're not going to mention the name of the person who disagrees with that theory. So it's not proper. Yeah. Now Hirschfeld says he should mention Hirschfeld, so they gave a little lip service to some of the people in Israel who happen to agree with my father.
Right, just enough to
mention his name,
make it seem fair at
exactly.
First,
you
right?
mention his name,
yes.
So then they can come out and say, "Oh, we give all points of view in the exhibit because they mentioned somebody's name."
So you started to mention a little bit about your articles. So you began in about 2007 or so to publish online articles under various pen names, criticizing what you believe to be one-sided museum exhibits on the scrolls. So why did you use pen names, and did you in fact have a vendetta against those exhibits, their curators, and the Qumran sectarian theory scholars presenting these lectures at the exhibits?
Well, the two different questions. First of all, pen names are traditional. If you want to avoid being retaliated against, use a pen name. I highly recommend the practice. And incidentally, I used, for the most part, one pen name for my articles, right? Then the other names I used, I posted little comments in which I attempted to draw people's attention to the article so that people would read it. I wouldn't consider it what some people like to refer to as sock puppetry, because you're using different names. Sock puppetry is when you're doing something for an illegitimate purpose. My purpose was perfectly legitimate. I was criticizing a museum exhibit, and I was trying to draw attention to the articles I had written about it. So there's this question of the truth here. The truth matters. Now, your other question was about a vendetta.
Did you have a vendetta against the museums and their exhibitions and the curators?
Is it a vendetta? Is it a vendetta to try to want to expose the truth about what people are doing? I don't really understand the idea.
I would hope wanting to reveal the truth about something is never really a vendetta.
So, I mean, what would be a vendetta? I can't
doing something to get back at somebody.
I can't quite get my head around that one, to get back at somebody.
Get it back at somebody other than just, as you said, to expose the truth about it. So what was the response like to some of these articles that you published?
Well, for the most part, I don't know. But at one point, somebody goes online and starts arguing with me. And a lot of people read the articles ultimately, some 60,000 people total, something like that. But eventually Cargill started quarreling with me online. So, and he would use pseudonyms himself, which kind of hinted that he knew who I was. He used variations of my name, things like that. It kind of developed into what you could call a flame war between me and this graduate student. It's absurd.
But those things happen in academic contexts. People do argue about issues that are important.
Yeah.
So you indicated that you sent pseudonymous emails to museums containing links to your various articles critiquing and satirizing what you believe to be monopolistic approach to scrolls scholarship. So approximately how many of these emails in total do you think you sent out during the period of around 2008 or so, and approximately how many of these did each person you sent them to receive?
I'm not good at math, Howard, so I don't know how to answer that question. You want to send a complaint about an exhibit, you send it to the board of trustees of a museum, so you copy different people in it. How many emails is that? Is that one email or is that 15 emails? I don't know how to think about this.
So to each individual recipient, how many times did you email an individual recipient? Roughly.
That's not the issue, Howard. The issue is why, what happened when these people were alerted to this? Mm-hmm. Why did they not mention the name of a certain professor from Chicago who was specifically criticizing the contents of these exhibits in scholarly articles? He published an article about the catalog of the 2007 San Diego exhibit, showing one mistake after another, shoddy errors made throughout this catalog, no response from the museum. Mm. Why not a word about this?
So when you sent these emails, you didn't send like 1,000 emails or 100 emails to an individual recipient. It was like somebody maybe have gotten a couple of emails, a few emails or something, a handful.
Not even.
Yeah, right. So like it's not like it was some huge deluge or anything. That's what I'm trying to ascertain here. So that's what. Yeah. Okay.
No. I never did anything of the sort. No, nobody ever alleged that I did anything of the sort.
So it was a relatively small volume, and just given that small volume, you can't imagine, or can you imagine, how somebody might have actually have felt harassed by such emails?
Imagine that we were talking here not about the Dead Sea Scrolls,
yes,
but about apartheid in Africa, South Africa, right? We're talking about apartheid in South Africa. People are enraged by apartheid in South Africa, and imagine that they had the internet, and they're sending emails about it. Angry emails to all kinds of people saying, you have apartheid, you belong to a company that's participating in this. We have to divest from your company. Or writing letter after letter after letter to companies saying, divest from South Africa. I think that that's something that people can innately understand. Not going to say, oh, that's wrong. Right. You must not contact people with companies who are involved in apartheid in South Africa because you're sending multiple emails. That's harassment.
Right. So like if I think there's a difference between sending, like, you send one person like a half dozen emails or something over a period of weeks or months or something. That, to me, doesn't strike me as harassment. I mean, somebody could interpret even one email as harassing, just if it made them uncomfortable.
Let me take this a bit further. Yes. They were saying that my father was harassing them by publishing his scholarly articles. Yeah. They used the word. I certainly hope that he will not harass the world of scholarship with his articles. So harassment is
it's a loose term sometimes,
It's a very loose term,
yes.
And it's when people tend to use this term in all kinds of, simply if they don't like something, they call it harassment. If we're talking about apartheid in South Africa, I could send 1,000 emails to somebody, to one person, and if you agree with me that apartheid in South Africa is a terrible thing and that we have to fight against it, you might not find that to be harassment at all. Or you might say, well, good, keep harassing him.
Yep. But the point is, you didn't send out thousands to one person or anything like that, which is, I think that's the key thing here. The Jewish Museum in New York presented a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibition in 2008, which for the first time included competing views of the origins of the scrolls, the pluralistic Jerusalem theories, and the traditional Qumran sectarian theories. How did this exhibit's opening up to competing ideas impact your blog and email campaign to alert and inform, as well as the wider debate among scholars?
Well, in this exhibit, they did exactly what I was saying should be done in the other exhibits. So of course I pointed that out.
Right. And how did it sort of inform the wider debate among scholars, the fact that they actually presented competing views?
I have no idea. I don't believe there was any reaction to this among scholars.
Right.
It was just
They did it, and nobody really seemed to change their opinions as a result. It wasn't revolutionary in that way.
Nobody was writing about the scrolls except my father at that time.
So what does the continued belief in the old sectarian theory of the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal about current social tendencies?
Well, over the past few decades in America, there's been a surge in belief in all kinds of off-the-cuff, unproven claims and conspiracy theories, all kinds of nonsense that you hear that's believed in by millions of people all over the country. So if you want to study how things like that emerge and catch on and are believed in by people, study the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a perfect example.
But you sort of touched on this a bit before, but why not just simply say that we have two alternative truths here?
I think there's somebody who once said that bullshit can be more dangerous for the truth than lies. And it conflates people's individual truths in the sense that each person has his own story, his own life, and we should listen to the other side of the story. It conflates that with the idea of scientific truth. Two totally different things. I can respect everybody's beliefs, everybody's personal histories. That doesn't mean that if you believe in rubbish, that's just as true as scientific truth. You know, if you think that the sun goes around the world, most people used to believe that the sun goes around the world. So that was true for them, but that doesn't make it an alternative truth.
There are some things that are just either facts or they're not facts.
So
Right.
that's really rubbish, and
Yes.
sorry to say so. And it's unfortunate because there's been a tendency over the years, a kind of a weakening of standards, and there's like a tendency in universities today to say, oh, I believe this, I believe that. People are no longer learning the kind of thing that my father had to study, for the criteria for analyzing a Hebrew manuscript and for determining, see, sometimes when he taught a class, he would end up focusing for an entire semester just on one sentence in a manuscript. So to, start the semester by saying, we're going to be studying this manuscript this semester. So they start studying it, and they get to a sentence which presents particular problems. He would end up coming back there every week and working on that sentence with the students, on one aspect of it, on another aspect of it, on just a single word. What could this possibly mean? How does it fit in? So that they are grateful to him for that, his students, because they learned not to mess up. Right? They learned that every single word counts. And we've lost this capacity today in the universities. It's become lax. It's a terrible problem.
There's a richness of knowledge comes from that, using that sort of approach to knowledge, to learning, and to studying things. Yes. So what role, if any, did former NYU deans play in the failure of the university to investigate allegations of plagiarism by Schiffman? And why did they not initiate an investigation?
They were informed. I mailed them the passages by snail mail. I put it in they received this in their mailboxes, so they were fully informed.
Right.
They did not investigate. They said something that one of them, I guess, testified at my trial that that since I had also sent them these satirical emails parodying Dr. Schiffman himself, They felt that the source of the accusations was not reliable, and that Dr. Schiffman had a reputation for honesty. But that's is that a real reason not to investigate? They had the passages in front of them.
Yes.
They were supplied with the evidence.
All we can do is make conjectures on that. So you sent a satirical email to NYU officials and grad students that appeared on the surface to be a confession by Professor Schiffman to plagiarism of Norman Golb's work. What is the difference between criminal impersonation and what you say is a parody or satirical mimicry? Can you define what is meant by parody and satire?
Well, again, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
And I liked what you said about on the surface. On the surface. Now, satire is a very complicated thing. There's a long history to satire, and in my book I go into that history. And the best way of learning about satire is to study that history. And part of the problem in the United States today is that we're losing touch with that. Part of this whole problem of what's going on in our universities. Satire is a fundamental part of human culture over the past 500 years. It's played an incredibly important role in social life, in politics, in everything, in religion. It's extremely important. And if you don't really get a grasp of what's involved in it, you're never going to get the concept. Now, before I go into further detail about satire, parody is just mimicry of somebody that's satirical. It's satirical imitation of a person. So once you know what satire is, then you know what parody is. Now, the fundamental thing to understand about satire is that satire is always stronger if there's some ambiguity about it. If you're not clear, if you think, oh, maybe this was written by the person, maybe this really isn't a satire. That's when satire is strong. If it's a weak satire, like you see on television, late night television, that's what satire is today. Satire today is what people see on late night TV. They have a good laugh, they go to sleep. But that's not what satire has been traditionally through history. A lot of satire isn't even very funny. It can be very serious. And the best example of this that I know of, the most recent example of this that I know of in the United States was during the 1960s, when you had a great period of satire, maybe the last great period of satire in American culture. There was a book that came out which was called The Report from Iron Mountain. I mention it in my book, but I might have spent more time on it, because this was taken seriously by many people, and today there are millions of people in the United States, because of campaigns by certain right-wing groups, there are millions of people who believe that the Report from Iron Mountain was an authentic text, and that the author only claimed that it was satire because he was trying to cover up, because he was worried that if he didn't admit that it was an authentic text, then he might have problems, right? This is like complete rubbish. We know the history of this text. It was a brilliant satire concocted by Leonard Lewin, was his name, a fascinating figure, and by a number of other people, incidentally. So it's not just him, but a group of 4 or 5 people got together and decided to do this satire. It was during the war in Vietnam, and they posed the question of, can a modern state exist in a state of peace? And they posited that a secret committee had been appointed by the government to analyze this question, and the report of this committee was this satire that they presented. And of course they didn't say, this is a satire. It's just, they just published it as if they had been given this by a secret committee. So there's always an element of hoax in strong satires. This goes back 500 years, right? So when the text came out, Some people were saying this must be a satire. Others were saying, oh, this must be a parody of the certain governmental things. And others were saying, oh, well, it's clearly a hoax. And others were saying, no, I think it's genuine. And today, millions of people across the United States believe that this was an authentic text. So that can tell you some of the dangers that are involved when you don't accept the satire as a satire, when you try to make it into something else. Because the whole idea of the deep state that we hear people talking about, it comes from that. That's the whole origins of this idea. And that's why they say it was an authentic text, because that's where they get this idea. It's complete rubbish.
Yeah, so a good satire is going to have a certain degree of ambiguity and confusion of the person, whereas a lot of the satires that you see on TV, the more contemporary satires, are just so obvious that they lose their impact.
Of course, they present themselves as satire.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So people, when I came out with my little satire, which was like a nothing of a satire, when I came out with that, people were saying, oh, but there was no expectation of satire. Go back 500 years, look at all the great satires. There's no expectation of satire ever. That doesn't exist. Nobody says, by the way, I'm giving you a satire here. It doesn't happen like that. That's just the nature of satire. That's how you provoke. That's how you create discussion. If it's on late night TV, if you know it's a satire, you get a good laugh, you go to sleep, and it's done and over with. It doesn't provoke discussion. Real satire provokes discussion.
So you touched on the notion that, satire doesn't even have to be funny. And of course, in many instances, it's not. So if it's not funny, do you think it can and should enjoy the kind of First Amendment protections that you sought to claim in your legal defense, if it's not funny?
Well, it does. The Supreme Court, in a famous case, they said that satire is protected. Okay, so that case happened to deal with something that many people might have found funny, but other people were deeply offended by. It was a magazine cover, and so it was an illustration of a kind of a caricature of Jerry Falwell. Mm-hmm. Is that funny, or is that an insult?
To some it might have been funny, to some it might have been an insult.
Okay,
yes,
so,
exactly.
So satire has all the ranges. Some satire is very funny.
Yep.
So think of another famous satire that many people don't find funny at all, is A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. Many people thought that this was an authentic text, that he was actually arguing that people should eat children, babies, right, to solve the problem of overpopulation. It's a theme that comes up in a lot of satire. It comes up in the report from Iron Mountain, incidentally, as well. Mm-hmm. So people think, he's telling us that we should eat babies, or that there's an actual governmental program, right, to the deep state is plotting that they're going to, if there's not a state of war, then what are they going to do about the explosion in the population? They're going to have to eat babies, right? So is that funny? Do people laugh when they read that? Some people will see the humor and laugh. Other people won't. And with my little thing, incidentally, some people said that it was sharp academic humor. Is that funny or not? Apparently, Dr. Schiffman didn't find it funny, but he testified that he laughed about it at a lecture that he gave. He said, maybe I shouldn't have laughed about it. So I don't know if he laughed about it because it was funny or for some other reason, but that's not how you evaluate satire.